came off lunch. This is always, the joy session of being tired and eating, but hopefully we'll have a thoughtful discussion. Hopefully I'll have time at the end that we can talk about some of these things. I gave a couple of these presentations yesterday, one much more broadly on the whole landscape of PC trends. This one's focused mostly on tablets, but if we leave it toward the end, we can talk about a range of different things that may interest you guys. My name is Ben Bajarin. My sort of lot in life from the industry standpoint is I'm what's known as an industry analyst. So I study markets, I study business models, I studied consumer trends, habits, things like that. I don't necessarily dig into the financials like a financial analyst would to make long-term stock bets. So I'm looking much more at the market, at the products, at buying trends, consumer psychology, things like that. And you can read more of my stuff. I write a tech column for Time, as well as our own sort of site, Tech Opinions, that's much more driven at just addressing industry issues than it is kind of broader, big picture things like I do for Time. But one of the things that we've been looking at, and I've been doing industry analysis with this firm for 12 years now. And when I first joined, I was primarily looking at the shift from enterprise computing, so business users using things like notebooks, desktops, and whatnot, and how that would shift and make its way into the broader consumer market. And over the past few years, we've obviously seen quite a bit of fundamental things happen that have brought this market to maturity, has brought about what we're all sort of talking about in the post-PC era. So I'm just going to explain that a little bit from our perspective about what we're understanding this to mean and happen, and why we think some of that I think sheds light on the importance of tablets, both their role now and the role that they will play in the future landscape of computing. But if you just understand technology at a fundamental level being a tool, tools that empower us to get things done, I think we were always at a fundamental level never going to be stuck with just one device that did that. It would be many. It would be not just this one machine that we know and love that looks like a clamshell notebook or that looks like a desktop. But that's really the only perspective we had for computing. Many of us, right? Many of us didn't necessarily sit and use mainframes and many of these things. And once the computer got into the hands of consumers and everybody could own one, that was the computer that we all know and love. And now it's starting to get a little bit more tricky. We've got smartphones, we've got tablets, and we've got a whole range of things that may show up. All of these things capable of doing computing tasks. And the way we now have to understand and look at both computing and how software and hardware and then services around that evolve is that it's not just going to be about one screen. And it's going to be all of these screens and how they work together. And really, it's going to be the context of human beings that dictate which one of those screens they use and want. So the smartphone may be sufficient for a fair amount of tasks, the tablet may be sufficient for another set of tasks, the desktop and notebook now sufficient for another group of tasks. But it really starts to become much more task-oriented when all of these screens start to invade our lives and the masses of consumers have access to them. And that's how computing is evolving. Computing is evolving from it's just me and my one device to now it's kind of me and my many devices and how those all sort of work together. And that's really where we're sort of eking into now with this post-PC era. And it's being driven obviously by things like smartphones and tablets, but there's a lot of new form factors on the horizon. There's a lot of experimentation happening with what this kind of new realm of computing will be and what it will mean. And I don't know if we've fully settled on all of the bits of that yet, because we are kind of at this point where a few years ago, all the companies that we work with, which is the vast majority of semiconductor guys and hardware guys and software guys that make these things, an inflection point had happened, and they had all recognized that the things that we all used to do when we approached making products is now changing to a new philosophy, and a lot of that's being driven by this multi-screen era that we're in. And the growth, which I think is one of the biggest indicators of something like tablets, you sort of look at what it takes in its rate of adoption. And this chart is one that MIT made early in 2011, just looking at 2010. And although it's hard to see, it just shows from the market availability to how long it took to get 10% penetration in the market, starting with telephone, electricity, radio, television, computer, the mobile phone, internet, smartphone, and then tablet in less than a year, getting 10% penetration across the board. And when you see things like that, it's hard to look at it and just sweep it under the rug as a short-term trend. It's something that you have to look at and dive deeper on, and then every year past that, you see the numbers still becoming significant. And what's interesting is that we think we'll hit 100 million tablets sold in this calendar year, which is a staggering number. It'll easily be the fastest consumer electronics to 100. But the second number is the one that I think is the most interesting, and it's the one that for the past year and a half I've been sort of ingraining into the notebook OEMs and the PC OEMs, because we roughly sell around 400 million, somewhere between, call it on a good year to a bad year, 370 to 400 million notebooks, desktops worldwide on an annual basis. And if this happens the way that we see it playing out, 2015 would be the year that tablets sold the same amount as we sell notebooks and desktops worldwide on an annual basis. And that's a big deal, because that would then justify not only the size of that market, the scope, but its potential reach being significantly larger than notebooks and desktops ever was. If we think that the smartphone by far has the biggest market, every human can own one, I think then the tablet is probably the second product in that environment, for a lot of the reasons that I'll sort of dive into today. But a lot of it is just based around this concept called touch computing. This idea of touch, this idea of pen-based inputs has been around for a really long time. It obviously took quite some time for it to get manifested into the marketplace at the point at which it was ready to be mass adopted. And that's really what we saw happen with both the iPhone, and then other smartphones paved the way, and then manifesting itself with the iPad, and then many other things that we'll see that come up after that. But it's really based around this idea of touch. And one of the interesting ways I think that you understand that is that if you take a tablet, and particularly the iPad, and you give it to a kid, or you give it to a senior citizen, or you give it to a person in China who's never seen one of these things before, or even used a personal computer, there's really no barrier to entry. They just start using it from the second they picked it up to its full potential. There's no learning curve. And it's very different. I have children. My 6-year-old, she still fumbles around with the mouse and the keyboard. There's a pretty significant barrier to her learning curve for her to use that. We don't see that same thing with tablets. And a lot of that just has to do with touch being, at a fundamental level, one of the most natural user interfaces that we as humans are used to. One of the things that I do when I do some of our consumer research is I go into retail and I just watch what consumers do. And a couple of months ago, I was at an Apple store in San Jose, and I had noticed that there was a table of senior citizens all being trained by one of the Apple store people. And the product they was using was not a notebook, it was not a desktop, it was an iPad. And when I asked the guy who did that training session, how frequent is this? How common do you have, senior citizens, people 65 and plus come in and use, look and buy an iPad and say, train me on this product, with, again, right, the learning curve being minimal, but he said, we're doing these 3 times a day. And one of the things that I think that really speaks to is a lot of people, and not even just children, not even just senior citizens or people who have never really been in the tech elite, this product for them was fine, but they never really got a lot out of it. They didn't use it to its maximum potential like a graphics designer would, or a game designer, or a programmer, or somebody who tweaks at these things. They just checked email, they got on the web, they did a very few things. Whereas with the tablet, they're actually looking to say, well, what more can I do with this? What are all the things I can do? And these are all questions that they never necessarily addressed or asked with the notebook or desktop form factor. And all of that, again, being driven by the natural user interface, for touch computing. There's other elements of this that I think this form factor is unique to, in that, if you think about it, we hold it like this, and we sit back. We can walk, we can go out into the world, you can go to a park, you can go to the beach, you can go to all of these different places and use it in ways that you never used something that looked like this. You don't normally see people walking around down the street, walking with this like this. But you see people doing that with iPads, and you see people doing that at the beach, and it just in places where computing was never really happening to this degree before. And I think we're only scratching the surface on what that kind of reality will look like when you've got this touch computer that goes out into the wild and people are using it for their surroundings. But it's that form factor. And even again, if you think about it from a use case, these things we sit and we use it and we keep them at arm's length. Whereas with the tablet, you can be very intimate with it. You can hold it, you can bring it in, and that adds this level of personalization to it that just didn't exist with other form factors. And the hardware is really what drives the beginning of this. I mean, one of the things that we always have to factor into when we look at technology is that, you know, making very, very simple solutions requires sophisticated technology. There's a lot that goes into these machines when you look at the component level. And that's going to continue. There's a lot of innovations on the horizon around glass, around silicon, around fiber. I mean, all of these things are going to continue to change how the hardware evolves and become that much more powerful. But it's this design that makes it that versatile. And even if you think about many of the designs that are coming out right now, the screen by itself, although compelling, becomes even more interesting when it's paired with accessories or additional hardware. The keyboards, for example, are the #1 selling accessory to the iPad. That's for a reason. It wasn't meant to require a keyboard, but when you add one, it now opens up a whole other door of possibilities about how you can use these devices. And we're seeing that happen all over the place. And I'll talk a little bit about a few more form factors that come into this. But the addition of a stylus, the addition of any number of other things, you know, video cameras, things that slip onto the port, how people are using these for transactions through things where you can slide credit cards on them. All of these things being driven by additional hardware. Again, all things that are this form factor is opening the doors to that, you know, the notebook desktop form factor just didn't allow. So the hardware playing a critical role in that. And one of the things that we're seeing right now is the bifurcation of screen sizes. And this is even getting more challenging, but I do think they'll narrow down around 2. You know, right now you've got 7. You've actually got 8.9 with a Kindle Fire. You've got 9.7 in the iPad, 10.1 with a range of others, and you'll see 11, and to be honest, you'll see 13. So, you know, all of that to say that right now there's sort of a jumbled, throw it all at the market, let's see what happens form factor, but I think it'll settle down around 2. And what's important to remember about that is that there's a difference between a 7 and a 10-inch in terms of how computing evolves. What I mean by that is that what we see in a lot of our research with consumers is, you know, when they buy an iPad, they use their notebook less or they stop using it entirely. And this is because it represents, again, because it's a larger screen size, you can do more with it, but it starts to creep into the same tasks that you did with your notebook, especially when you pair it with the keyboard. I mean, I travel frequently when I go a number of different places with just my iPad, and I use it with my keyboard, and I don't need much more than that. There are times for other form factors, but that gets you pretty far. And a lot of consumers are recognizing that. The 7-inch, I don't think, represents a let's replace our notebook philosophy in the market. I think it represents more of a complementary piece of hardware to something like a notebook or a desktop, being much more driven by media and consumption and those types of things. But I don't think we'll see the same third-party accessory for productivity around 7-inch that we've seen for 10. And I don't think we'll see the same, you know, you buy one of these and then all of a sudden you just don't really use your notebook anymore. And that's just where we're at in the market. The market is still early in maturity. People will figure these things out. They'll figure out what works best, and then they'll buy their solutions accordingly. But that I think is the way that we'll see these things. And again, it really comes down to, you know, are these devices meant to be replacements for that form factor, or are they meant to complement? And that's what I think this form factor shift will represent. The other bits that get a little bit interesting, mostly driven by Windows 8, is convertible sliders and hybrids. So this is, again, sort of this fleshing out of the market that we're seeing. I don't know if all of these different variations can exist in the marketplace, but I think right now we're seeing quite a bit of experimentation around them, but each of them are kind of bringing some unique benefits. This one here on the left is the Lenovo Yoga. Basically, it looks exactly like a clamshell notebook, but the screen flips to the other side, and then you've got it on tablet mode. So you can do a number of things with that. One, in this mode, you can switch it around, show it to whoever's sitting on the other side of you as a presentation. You can flip it down and have people gather around it to use it. Will come in a range of different screen sizes. It's the same sort of concept, although not portable, with the one in the middle, which is an Asus design around Windows 8. This design is a 27-inch all-in-one. Actually can slide down onto the table and be flat, and then it can also flip to be in portrait mode. That's just an all-in-one. This one's a convertible. I don't have a picture of the slider because there's really only one or two, and that's just where the screen, instead of flipping over like the Yoga, would just flip like here and then slip down. So the back is still this, whereas with the Yoga, the back is the keyboard, which is kind of clunky from the ones I've used. And so that's an all-in-one. That's more of a desktop stationary machine. But again, you could get people around it. Multiple people could draw it and use it. It can support more than 5-point touch, which some of these can only support 2 or 3. So again, just differences. And then the one on the right's the Microsoft Surface, which we're calling a hybrid, which you're seeing a lot of these come out in the market. This one form factor is the one I think Windows 8 might be uniquely designed for. This is where the screen detaches from the keyboard. So it can be used both in tablet mode with all the glory that I described of touch, but then as soon as you want to use it with a keyboard, you've got that. And the difference being that Apple didn't design the iPad to be used with a keyboard. They designed it to assume you don't need one, which is, I think, a good philosophy by itself, but yet third parties made that hardware to be a complement. We're seeing these hybrid designs come out where they're intentionally building the keyboard to go along with it. And one of the things that's interesting about Surface is, the way that magnet is done is, you can actually hold it and shake it, and it will not come off from that magnet. So there's elements of that I think become really interesting. But again, that's the hybrid that can convert. And that form factor, I think, represents the best idea of the best of both worlds, the best of what I want in a notebook and the best of what I want in a tablet. And I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens with this category and how the market evolves with it. But there's even more on the horizon. I mean, believe me, you'll see more than just what I'm explaining here happen. And I don't know if it'll all stick, but all of these things will have touch, and that's, I think, the fundamentals of what is going to move this forward as we move away from the idea of a disassociated mouse as a input mechanism to using our fingers, multi-touch, and beyond in conjunction with physical keyboards or not. But really, it's the software that makes all of this stuff function. If you have an iPad or a phone, if it's not on, it's basically a paperweight until it comes on. That's really where the magic happens, is in the software. And interestingly, if you've tracked what's happened with software over the decades that computing's been around, I think you can make a really strong point that we're in the rebirth of the software industry in ways that maybe we've never really seen before. This notion of the app economy has made it much easier to write software. The App Store has made it much easier to acquire and purchase that software. We just don't see consumers walk into retail and stare at shrink-wrapped software to figure out what software they want anymore. This paradigm is changing completely, and it's being driven obviously by the platforms that are allowing it, but we're seeing software developers now get really, really excited about software. And the most important thing is that it's almost unanimously now including touch. They're not just thinking about software with a keyboard and a mouse and a terminal that really doesn't move to go on the world. And so we're seeing new software be developed that was never really comprehended before, and we're seeing a lot of people do it. And I think we're just scratching the surface of this, but the bottom line is touch paired with this new hardware, paired with many of the new visions of software we're seeing, make computing more engaging, more fun, more immersive, all of these things that just didn't exist in the computers of past. A couple examples of this that I think are important is this is iPhoto from Apple on the iPad, and I use this example for a reason because I think it really demonstrates what touch computing means and what touch computing can represent as we go forward. This is just a simple picture of a landscape, but what it's demonstrating is that with the swipe of a finger, left or right, you can change the hue or saturation or colors of that image. So you can make the sky bluer, you can make the sky lighter, you can make the greens greener, all of these things that you can manipulate now with the swipe of a finger. Now in Photoshop, that's roughly an 8-step process and probably a 10-minute task to do that one thing right there. Yet with the swipe of a finger, anyone can do something that took a creative professional quite some time to do. And this, I think, just scratches the surface, because where those can go for video editing, where that can go for content creation, where that can go for productivity, where that can go for, again, like education, and all of these things that were once designed with a file, a menu, an 8-step process, a mouse, and a keyboard, now thinking about when I can use my fingers to manipulate and create, I think we get into very interesting territory. And again, all of that being driven by touch. This is an example of the Samsung Note 10.1. Samsung took an approach with this product that focused specifically on productivity. They added a stylus. They retweaked Android in order to support multitasking, multiple management of windows. I mean, all of the things that we're used to in a notebook, and they've reserved that now to a tablet form factor. And they've built this whole thing around this concept. And you're seeing a lot of different vendors take this approach where, you know, they're trying to break out of the conversation that tablets are only for consumption and really start thinking about hardware and unique software that lends to the story that these things can be much more powerful computing devices than originally anticipated. And then even if you look at some of the software that's out there, and again, the best examples I think right now exist on iPad, and I hope that they will continue to come to other platforms. But you know, the ways that we're seeing these be embedded in the language arts, and how they can be used for reading and phonics when you can start, you know, drawing a letter and having the program work with you in real time. One of the popular apps, which you might be familiar with, is called Word Quiz. That basically, when kids are in the learning process to read, it gives you a word, whether it's, you know, a 2-letter word, 3-letter word, or whatever, and as you touch the letter and drag it up, it sounds it out as you then spell the word. So it teaches you good phonics and a fundamental basics in that environment. You're probably familiar with what's happening with next generation immersive books. You know, Apple's doing a lot in this category. Amazon's, you know, doing it where it's not just text anymore. It's text plus video plus audio plus immersive manipulation of those objects, which all lend to that learning experience, I think, and again, in ways that this product really never was either designed to do or really capable of. Other examples that I think are pretty profound around the software are things with applications being developed for kids with learning disabilities like autism or dyslexia. There's a number of applications, I mean, again, more than 2 dozen that are built just to uniquely be implemented in the therapy process of these things. And the results from them are coming back, you know, saying this is just stuff that we couldn't do before. This tool has opened up new doors that weren't there. And again, a lot of that being driven by the immersiveness of touch and the natural elements of touch and using our hands to interact with those environments. And I think, again, there's a lot of really good examples, but I still think we're just scratching the surface on how this is used in all of these key categories. But it really is going to come down to platforms. You know, right now we have 3 key platforms that are impacting us from a computing standpoint, particularly as it relates to tablets. But it's not just the platform; it's also the ecosystem. And so when we think about these things, we look at them, you know, we look at them holistically from product, platform, ecosystem. And one thing I constantly say to a lot of the hardware vendors, it's not just how good your product is, it's how good your ecosystem is. Because consumers are now understanding that they're investing quite a bit into these technologies. It's not just you know, a computer that they're, you know, or a platform that they can just jump back and forth from year to year. And because of that, you know, we're seeing these new ecosystems be developed. That's both hardware, software, accessories, services, all these things that's built around these platforms. And right now, you've got Apple's with iOS, and then obviously on the desktop, the computing or the desktop notebook side with OS X, you know, Windows 8's kind of all those things brought together into one with their ecosystem, which again we're just on the brink of, but that will move fairly quick. And then we have Android, and you know the one point I bring up about Android is that they you know, they really only make phone and tablet software. They don't necessarily make notebook or desktop software, whereas the other two do make those other screens and have software for those other screens. So that just, again, is a point to strengthen the ecosystem. But I think there's pluses and negatives to all of these different platforms when you're looking at them. But you know, what we're telling both enterprises, what we tell consumers is, you know, in all these different groups is it's best to just make a commitment to one and then stay with it. It's harder to make an investment in one than switch to something else, and the infrastructure change of that's a bit more difficult in the short-term future. Long-term, that might be a little bit different when we start talking about cloud and cloud computing. But there's a lot of different ways that this is changing things. I think the workforce has been one of the first ones that we really started to track onto. I mean, the numbers of iPads in particular that are being deployed in enterprise is pretty significant enough that you start to look at that and say, okay, clearly there's groups of people who are using these things and are not using notebooks. And for those of us that track these things and create forecasts around where they go, that's a big deal. And one of the things that we're seeing is that the way it's impacting work is it's very segmented, right? So if you get my philosophy of post-PC, prior in the enterprise, everybody got one of these. Now you're starting to think through, okay, well, is that really the right tool for my guy who goes out into the field in a UPS truck, or my ambulance driver, or you know, my construction worker? Is that the right tool for them? Or those in sales or marketing? And that's really where we're seeing these things happen. We're seeing all of those field workers, all of those mobile workers, those who go and show houses or apartment buildings or condos, or who give sales presentations or marketing presentations, and all of those things, software is being developed for them uniquely around the tablet form factor, because again, it's the environment. If I'm a salesperson or a marketing person, to just hold a screen and show it to you is very different than me kind of using this and then flipping it around. So it really changes the relational context, and I think some of those things are parts of what's really making that that part doable. The other that's starting to be really interesting is how tablets are being implemented with this notion of glanceable data. And there's been a number of CIOs of Fortune 500 companies that we've interviewed who are doing this now for their enterprises, where they're having custom software written right now for iPad, but they're having custom software written that they're basically creating a holistic business dashboard that right there from their tablet they can pull up all the information from sales to marketing to engineering in real time and manipulate that data in order to have all of their information at their fingertips to make a key decision when they need to make a key decision. So CEOs are loving this. A range of C-level executives are buying onto this philosophy because of how efficient it makes them in their workforce. And I think that's an example of what happens when we have all of this collection of data, and how can we make that data much more presentable, much more useful, and then bring touch into the equation for us to manipulate and look objects and bring that natural UI with it as we're sort of sifting and looking and trying to interpret all of this data. So we call that glanceable. Again, just a dashboard of real information in real time at a glance, and we're seeing that really start to take hold in a number of different enterprises, and I think that trend will continue. One of the things that's interesting when we think about tablets as well, if you some of those form factors I showed, you can lay them on the table, people can gather around them. We're also seeing these devices, they can work in kind of a synced mode. The Samsung tablet has a thing called screen share, so if we all had one, you could all be sitting there, I could be walking through my presentation, and we can all be marking it up and collaborating in real time on the same bit of data. And that's just how all those now, however many screens there are actually working together at the same time to collaborate, produce, and be immersive. And that also carries over to things like gaming that we're seeing. We're seeing a lot of game developers build support for multiple screens. So, you put an iPad on the table, and then everybody has an iPhone, and that becomes your checkerboard, that becomes how you manage your cards or whatever. And it's all these screens now working together as a part of a holistic experience. So there's a lot of different ways that these types of devices, I think, are getting into the market, impacting these types of things like playing in again, ways that we haven't, ways that other form factors have not. And the one thing that I think is interesting on that is a way to also sort of think about how tablets evolve is that they don't even necessarily need to be lumped into it's me and my individual tablet. I think that the idea of communal screens or shared screens starts to become very interesting as a line of thinking that didn't exist with this form factor. So, for example, I don't normally pass my notebook to my wife or my children, but I'm pretty happy to give them my tablet or my iPad or whatever it is in order for them to do things on it as well. Amazon, I call this family computing because I'm looking at it from a family standpoint, but I think you can bring that into a classroom, you can bring that into an enterprise, the idea of all of these devices not necessarily being one person's, but being agnostic to the person, but having all their key stuff on it. Amazon actually developed an element of their current generation Kindles that addresses this called Kindle Fire Free Time, where you can set up parental controls for a kid or any other family member, and you can hand them that product, and it's now a closed, walled garden environment where, say, for example, you say they can play any game that's approved for them for 30 minutes a day. They can watch video for 30 minutes a day. They may or may not have access to the web browser based on their age, but they can read infinitely, for example. So you can set these parental controls, hand them the tablet, and know that you're not worried about them going to a website they shouldn't go to, that they're not playing that sucker more than they should. So you can lock those down. And Barnes & Noble actually took it further with their concept of profiles. And one of the reasons I think this is really cool is because it actually takes advantage of the cloud kind of vision for this concept. And with their new Nook HD products, you can create a profile for any member of the family, and then when that person logs in, they see their books, their periodicals, their games, their web browser bookmarks, their stuff. And the cool element about the cloud of that is that, let's say my wife and I are reading the same book. When I log in, it remembers where I left off. When she logs in, it remembers where she left off. And that's an example of the cloud now understanding me, who I am, my personal preferences relative to my content in that regard, but not necessarily making it be me and about my screen. That's everyone's screen. It's a screen agnostic approach that I think is interesting. And again, those parental controls being built into that, I think become really, really interesting. And that's just, again, that's not something that Apple is addressing, this idea that let me hand this to my kids and let them go full bore with it. There's elements of parental controls that I think are out there, but that's the difference between whether or not the tablet is mine or whether it's my family's. And even if I had 4 or 5 of these, the idea that I could just pick it up, log in, regardless of which one it is, and have my stuff, I think is a compelling concept. So that's the difference of what this communal screen can mean. And again, that's not something the smartphone represents. This is mine. This is not something that this necessarily represents. This is mine. But that screen can actually be the one that can address this idea of a communal, of a family, of a group's product that's not necessarily tied to one of them. But again, that's going to rely heavily on cloud services to be successful. So I'll leave you with just a couple of thoughts that I think are key to this, and then we have some time if you want to discuss anything. But the bottom line is the prices of these will come down. This is an area that this whole industry, everybody that I talk to understands that this product represents an opportunity for the billions. To get to the billions, especially those in emerging markets where we're very interested in the growth of this. For example, notebooks grow at 21% a year in China. Tablets are growing at 210% a year in China. The same will be true of India, the same is true of Africa, but the bottom line is we got to get those products below $100. To get it below $100, there's going to be some trade-offs, both in terms of design and hardware and software, but again, I think that paradigm of whether it's mine, personal computer versus communal tablet, how cloud plays into that can drive these costs down over the next 4 to 5 years. But that's something everyone recognizes in this space, so we're on a path to make these things cheaper, and I think Apple will as well. Many of those, though, are going to be continually more dependent on services. It's not just about the hardware, nor will it be just about the software. It'll also be about the services that enable these things in ways that we think are key and we think are important. So there'll be sort of that hardware, software, services model that goes into it. What services those are, I think we've got some that are showing up. I mean, Amazon is a hardware as a service model. Barnes & Noble is a hardware as a service model. There's a number of others that can take that approach. But we are going to see these things, in order to get the cost down, be tied to services. What those are, again, I'm not sure. An example of this could be if someone like Walmart or someone like Best Buy or even someone like Verizon just says, I'd rather just give you one of these tablets for free, in hopes that you'll just pay my data plan, and really all it does is simply have some apps and browse the internet. Right? That could be an example of how they get cheaper, but again, it's tied to a service, either from an individual or a corporate standpoint. But that's the reality. We'll get the costs down on hardware, but it's going to come with a service dependence that we're going to pay for or amortize over time. The personal to communal screens, I think, is the important one. But really, where this all goes is we will continue to see a fundamental shift from software over to this idea of cloud-based software and cloud-based applications. And when you think about how that evolves, one, it makes it so that we can make these products cheaper because we're not necessarily dependent upon premiums both in hardware or premiums on the app front. But we can bring new applications that are given by the cloud, so all these devices really need to do is connect to the internet. This is a whole vision of Google's Chrome OS project, is that everything just runs in the web, apps run in the web, and all the browser has to do is understand that current generation programming language. But if we move in that direction, then interesting things start to happen. And one thing that very few people are noticing is that every developer, every tier 1, tier 2 developer that's writing a native Android or iOS application is simultaneously making a web app. So at some point in time, over the next 2 to 3 years, you will have equally as amount of web apps as you will that exist in the Android store or in Apple's App Store, and then arguably whatever Microsoft gets up to. And so at some point in time, we'll be able to just have one of these Chrome or cloud-only devices and have all the same apps that we have today. And if that path continues in that direction, you can think about how costs can come down. But it makes the point that investment in the internet as the platform of the future versus investment in something like Windows 8 or iOS or one of those things. And when developers now are embracing this concept of the web is the future platform, not necessarily tied to a local OS, I think we start getting into the long-term direction of where we go with a lot of these products that I think will help feed both bringing products, the costs down, but really take shape of what we're committing to in terms of resources, and then, again, how dependent we'll all be on the internet going forward, as well as these particular devices. So that's it in a snapshot. We got a few minutes if anybody wants to ask any questions or dialogue.